Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dimpho Takane, and I think I'll be speaking from a postgraduate perspective. I'm doing my master's and I specialize in African philosophy. So I heard that, the department is launching an African Center for Epistemology and Philosophy of Science, and I thought, yay. But I think, similar to the previous speaker, I will also be kind of cautioning the center and maybe posing some challenges and some things to consider. Okay. So I thought of the launch of the center, and I think this is what probably Steve Biko would say at this day and age. I quote, "A black man should be more independent and depend on himself for his freedom and not to take it for granted that someone would lead him to it. The blacks are tired of standing at the touchlines to witness a game that they should be playing. They want to do things for themselves and all by themselves." So I think it's an appropriate time now that Africans are finally doing it for themselves. Africans thought it necessary to come up with a center that is relevant in addressing issues that we are facing as Africans. But what we also need to consider is that for Africans, literature and knowledge serve a completely different purpose. It serves a purpose to expose and to fight against all the forces that deny them of their existence. Now, I have 3 concerns in this presentation, and which I think the center should also consider, taking up the center and moving forward. So the first one is, which Africa are we talking about, or which Africa is the center, for? And the second one is, what kind of consciousness drives the center, and for whom is the center set up for? Like I've already mentioned, my aim in this presentation is to just caution the founders of the center and those who will be working in taking up, the work of African philosophy. Now, in the website, this is what I found, the ASEP's website. So they claim that they pursue all their projects within African conscience through encouraging work that is distinctly African in nature and salient to African challenges and concerns. The center considers as fundamental the issues, the consciousness, the perspectives, the concepts, the struggles, and the exclusions that come with where we are situated, and this informs the kind of research that the center is hoping to take up. Now, which Africa are we talking about here? In my head, I thought there are 2 kinds of Africa. We have the Western Africa, which has been painted as ahistoric, as primitive Africa, as Africa that is weak, Africa that is dark, and then we have this African Africa that I think really still needs more work, that still needs to be uncovered and exposed to the global community. Okome argues, that Western literature has invented the notion of Africa as a dark continent, a notion very similar to one invented of a helpless, confused, powerless African woman that cannot determine and construct changes that are needed in her life. And similarly, Hegel, and this was taken in Ank Granis's article that was published last year, argues that the characterization of Africa's pre-colonial cultures and societies as ahistorical and primitive was one of the main obstacles to unprejudiced, solid research in the history of philosophy regarding that region of the world. So I think the center will need to guard against it just being an African center based on its situatedness. The fact that it's based in Africa, then we give it the label African. There are many institutions, many institutes, many centers that are running just on the tag African because they're based or situated in Africa. So I think that's the first caution. Now, moving on to consciousness. Which consciousness, or what kind of consciousness is going to be driving the center? We can argue that there is some progress in engagements and production of publications regarding philosophy in Africa. However, we cannot deny the fact that African concepts are rarely included in standard works on philosophy. So there's still very much shortage or limited literature that is being engaged in African philosophy, or just in African literature as a whole. So my question is, what then sets ASEPs apart? If there are institutes, if there are centers that are already doing the job, what's so special about ASEPs? What sets them apart? And Anne Grannis, again in the same article published in 2016, she argues that, well, what influences the perception and development of African knowledge should be, I think, also amongst these four things. And I think these are the four things that the center also needs to take into consideration, and maybe what might set them apart from the already existing engagement and centers that are working in African knowledge. And the first one is that, you know, when you're working in African philosophy or in an institution working in African philosophy, you also need to take caution to the fact that universities have this canon-forming power. Universities are the ones that control the curricula. They have a say of, you know, selecting the curricula that students are going to do or read or work on. So what should set the center apart, I think it should be driven by a consciousness that is seeking to also use that authority, the power that they have to change the curricula that's already being studied in universities. And the second thing that I think should drive, or the second consciousness, kind of consciousness that I think should drive the center, is on the issue of place of publication. We know that most publications are not locally produced, and most of the most influential publications are produced overseas. So the center should start considering how it plans, or, you know, what's the plan of getting academics into the global community, and not just in the global community to just, you know, partake in what is already being done in global community, but to bring an African context in, or an African voice in the engagements that are already been happening. And the third type of consciousness, it's on the issue of financial resources. If we consider where we're situated right now, the continent is not doing very well in terms of financial resources. So what I think can set the center apart is if they're driven by a consciousness that there is a shortage of resources in the continent. How do we plan on merging or providing academics, postgraduates, students with the opportunity, with the lack of resources in mind? How do we plan on providing them with that opportunity to be able to publish? You know, publishing costs are too expensive for many academics. They can't even afford to participate in debates and engagements that are happening in global community because they just merely can't afford. And the last thing that I think can set the center apart is the issue of language. Well, African centers that claim to be working on African knowledge still oftentimes rarely use African languages. So maybe it should feature in its taking up this huge task of stepping into African knowledge and investigating African knowledge, find a way of incorporating the issue of languages. And this is based on two things. The first thing is that when you read an article or literature that has been written in a language that's not my own language, it's first difficult for me to understand that literature, right? So I first have to translate the literature in order for me to make sense of the literature. But I think the second important thing is that in the process of translating the literature, the core thing of that literature is lost. Oftentimes this, you know, translating from one language to the other, you find that even the core thing that was in the literature is lost. So I think maybe the center would want to consider these four things to set them apart from the already existing centers that are working in African philosophy or African knowledge. And I think another kind of type of consciousness that needs to drive the center is the acknowledgement that there are different ways of knowing. For the longest time, non-Western ways of knowing have been discredited, like the previous speaker has mentioned. And you find, for instance, in the work of Paul Offit, where he argues that there is only one kind of medicine that works and medicine that doesn't work. He completely dismisses alternative and complementary medicine as well as integrated and holistic kinds of medicine. And if you seriously probe into the statement, you find that this kind of medicine that he's speaking of is an indigenous kind of medicine that he's trying to dismiss. So my last concern is of whom the center is, who is the center set up for? And I think this goes beyond just producing research on African knowledge, African philosophy, anything that's African. And I think this should also be thought of from a historical basis. And Houston argues that colonialism and the supremacy of the West have helped create the gap between indigenous people and their current situation. And unfortunately, contemporary education still reinforces that gap. It's continuous gap between one's existence and where they come from. So I think the center needs to start thinking of ways to negotiate this gap. And he continues to argue that, when seeking to reconcile different ways of knowing, the intention is to heal and rebuild indigenous people by restoring their ecologies, their consciousness and languages, and by creating bridges between indigenous and Western knowledge. So it's not an argument of saying one should be over the other. We've been living in a Eurocentric, reading Eurocentric literature for the longest time, but it's to give both equal footing and build that bridge where they can come together. So I think the center should also, I'm sure you now realize I've drawn a lot from Black consciousness, but I think the center should also be set up for a people that has lost pride in themselves, a people that has lost values, a people that has lost their existence, So it should be driven by a consciousness that seeks to infuse those kind of people with a newfound pride in themselves, in their efforts, in their value systems, in their culture, their religion, and their outlook to life. So it's, like I was saying, it goes beyond just producing research, but it's about what that kind of research mean, or the influences of that research to that people that it speaks about. Maybe think of engaging them in discussions and conversations and let them speak for themselves. We have been speaking for them for the longest time. Engage them and hear what they have to say. And that will be providing those kind of people with a kind of liberation, which Biko thinks that liberation is of paramount importance in the concept of Black consciousness, for we cannot be conscious of ourselves and yet remain in bondage. We cannot be producing research about African continent and yet have, still have limited financial resources and everything else in between. So I do acknowledge the need and relevance for the center and the continent. And similar or same as Grenes argues here, I think it will be a very long process to change the unequal epistemological and political economic terms under which academic work is done today. It's a process which can be influenced only partially by philosophers. However, equally important, it is our will to change the ways academics work and how academic debates are conducted today. So I think it's a step in the right direction in emancipating the continent and its people. So big ups. Thank you.